Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to projectCD.Chronicles. And finally, here we are with our Arch Linux, specifically with CachyOS. As you can, it's installed on physical hardware, specifically on an ARSB 400 Professional. I'm using a 4K display. Well, that's QT, and I'm running an AMD Ryzen 5950X processor with 32 cores. In fact, this is not a virtual machine, and I'm using my Radeon 7900 XTX. This machine is basically dedicated to rendering and more intensive computing tasks. I wanted to use this distribution for a simple reason. It does come from Arch Linux, but Arch Linux is Arch Linux, so it doesn't come from Debian, it doesn't come from Ubuntu, it doesn't come from Linux, it doesn't come from Patch, and so on. It's all right here. By the way, it's highly optimized, it's a rolling release, and it still has a very respectable and up-to-date software package. It's still stable and efficient, and as you can see, it runs the latest kernel 6.15, so it's up to date, and it can also access the entire range of AUR repositories. A must-have. But let's talk now, above all, about some features of CachyOS based on Arch. And then at the end, in the second part, through some slides, because I took some photos. I could have done it with Holo OBS as well, like I'm doing right now, and recording from a USB stick, but I wanted to show the real thing, the raw experience, the actual installation with a bit of troubleshooting. Let's continue directly on the page where I downloaded it. It's the very latest version, the one from May, which was released just a few days ago, and I installed it. I should mention that since it's a rolling release, the images are updated, let's say, every month as part of the rolling process. So what can I say? Blazingly fast, customizable Linux distribution. That is, it's a distribution based on Arch Linux, and it's designed to offer speed, stability, and advanced customization. Now, through the wikis, and especially the main page, let's talk about the main features, and then we'll take a closer look at them in more detail. And as I mentioned, there will be a second part where I briefly show the installation in a short separate presentation. All right, let's continue with our review. Let's start here with a list of features. So basically, what are we dealing with? Optimized performance. First of all, it uses a Linux kernel with a Bohr scheduler, which we will soon see how it works. There are also several different types, but this one, let's say, improves both interactivity and speed. Then we have a series of, let's say, optimized packages in this distribution because they are compiled directly with flags specifically for the type of processor, whether it's x86-64, version 3, version 4, Zen 4, and in addition, as I was reading here, as you can see here, BCO and OBOLT optimizations are performed to maximize optimization as much as possible, and therefore also the speed. Next, select your preferred edition. We have a wide selection of desktops, and we can choose any of them. By the way, when I installed it on the USB stick, so after I downloaded it, which was a few gigabytes, 2.8 gigabytes, the new version was actually 100 megabytes smaller than the previous one. So something was removed because it's an essential distribution that we then add to from here. Perfect, without a bunch of bloatware. And what does it offer? Well, as you can see, I have Plasma here. I like Plasma, but it also supports, and here there's a whole range: GNOME, XFCE, X3, Wayfire, LXQT, OpenMox, Cinnamon, and others. As you can see, There's also the Made Desktop that you can select when you install it, especially as we'll see later. There are really a lot of options. So, the installation process has also been greatly improved, since now we have a GUI through Calamares, making it a much more intuitive installation compared to the command line, which is still available for more advanced users. And that's what happens with Arch. So what else can I say? We also have advanced support for the kernel, and here too, within the kernel, we have the possibility, according to the documentation, to choose, though this is already at an advanced level, between different kernels and schedulers, obviously optimized for various needs and for the workload that Arch Linux, or in this case CachyOS, is handling. Undoubtedly, one of its strengths is the community, solid documentation, and, again, through the wiki, and let's be honest, to put it simply, there have been significant, let's say, improvements made. Actually, we now have several different bootloaders. While I use Grub, which actually isn't the default one, but for example, we have a new bootloader. It's also mentioned here in the documentation, Limine or Liminin, which is now able to support both BIOS and UEFI with options for, let's say, theming. It's much more similar to Grub. The reason I chose it is mainly because, first of all, we now have extended compatibility for RDA, both version 3 and 4, and there have also been improvements introduced, especially regarding NVIDIA 5070 and 5070 Ti graphics cards, okay? So, these are the latest ones that have come out. What else can I say? Actually, as far as everything related to AMD cards goes, there really aren't any issues because I had the chance to test it out quickly. The only thing I still need to check is whether it's possible to install it from the AUR repositories, because since I have a Radeon XTX, the hip acceleration that I usually use on Windows, well, specifically for my Radeon card, I need to see if that's available. What else can I say? So, there are improvements in the firmware regarding GSP, but those are all closed source modules anyway, and obviously, as you can see in the distribution section, if we scroll down, well, here there's a whole section. We also have the option to choose between two types of downloads. One is basically the desktop type, while the other is more, let's say, optimized for gaming. It's not that it's more optimized. Let's say both distributions are optimized, but the second CachyOS distribution that we can, install is, let's say, it comes with a set of pre-configured tools specifically for gaming, and it's optimized precisely to allow for maximum gaming performance. So we'll have Wine, which now supports WoW 64 and therefore reduces all dependencies on, for example, 32-bit libraries. Additionally, and I'm talking about the gaming side of the distribution, there's native Proton support. Proton is updated natively, and we also have Steam included, so we can actually play games and have an excellent frame rate, almost comparable to Windows. We also have full support for Wayland, for Wine Wayland, and of course, we have remarkable compatibility, especially for the DualSense controllers I have here. What else can I say? CachyOS doesn't stop here. It keeps evolving, offering an undeniably Linux experience. So, Arch, of course, that is highly customizable, powerful, fast, and up to date with the times. And in my opinion, I think it can absolutely work as a desktop distribution on par with Windows, if not even better in some ways. But of course, in the end, it's the benchmarks that have the final say. Obviously, let's go back. And as a true Arch user, if I can call myself that, but really, as a Linux user, of course we have to return to the command line. So, the kernel version is 6.15, and also, for the few packages, you can see here it already gives me, basically everything that's already precompiled. It also gives me more information about the package, the module package, and the modules that are installed within the kernel. CachyOS, Linux, of course, we have the scheduler, then we have, well, the various VirtualBox and GuestOS modules, and so on. So we already have some extra information. Well, obviously here I've installed Plasma, Kdplasma. So from the command menu, we can check out more information here from 6.3.5, but also with Plasma, here, Plasma plus Plasma Desktop, we're able to get even more details regarding the Plasma Desktop itself. As you can see, 6.3 Plasma Desktop, the level of optimization, the dependencies of the various modules, the installed theme, and so on. Alright, then as I was saying, there's a whole series of for example, the ones that are supports for video cards, and we can check them out in this section. So let's go. Whereas, let's say, in my case, as a pro, I've already done this and checked other things. Basically, I used a tool called Radeon Top, and I've installed it as well. Here it gives me information related to the Radeon. Well, obviously right now it's idle. I'm not using it. So basically everything is at 0%. And here we come back. There's still something to mention, which is that, in fact, Firefox is back. So, once again, Cachy has been replaced by Firefox as the default browser. And here too, if we go through the menu, we can see the various dependencies. And as for the Firefox package, it's version 139, of course. Well, what else can I say? Let's wrap it up here. We have the Wayland desktop as default, and also, according to what I read on the wiki, there have obviously been improvements regarding Proton, the Mesa drivers, the graphics drivers, and everything else related to optimizing performance as much as possible, even for gaming or anything involving graphics. What else can I say? Obviously, I didn't focus on what are, so to speak, the dash. All the parts that are usually shown in the various distributions, the ones that are a bit more appealing. We saw something from what is the command line. Obviously here it's much more specific. Wayland, server, memory, the status of Samba, which by the way has been significantly improved. And here too we have a whole management section regarding the system monitor. However, since we're dealing with CachyOS and it's derived from Linux, Arch, I preferred to show this Linux distribution specifically from this perspective. Well, what can I say? Now I'll combine this with the second part about the installation, which I recorded a bit with my phone, since at the time it seemed like the most convenient option available to me. Even though I could have used OBS Studio to film, so to speak, the installation live on my computer screen, it only occurred to me afterwards that this would have been a more straightforward and perhaps higher quality way to capture the process. I snapped a few photos and, in the end, did a bit of troubleshooting with a quick and highly effective command line fix. What else can I say? Thanks everyone. See you in the second part coming up next. And here we are with the second part of the video, just like I promised. I made some slides, some screenshots, some photos I took instead of filming the installation process live with OBS. I could have done that, but I preferred to just take some photos and include them in the second part, rather than making a separate video about the installation. Honestly, it's really very simple, and I'll just focus on a few aspects that I think are most relevant. So, as you can see, this is the part where you launch the installer, and it's also the welcome page where you can select different languages. Here, English is set as the default, but Italian is available too. There are actually quite a few options. You also get an overview of Welcome to CachyOS, covering the software and the unique features of this operating system. All right, so this is one of those few parts one wanted to install or at least show you. Because when we choose CachyOS, it actually asks us, which bootloader do you want? So we have Grub available, System Boot, which is the default, refined, ASCAP, and Limine, or however it's pronounced. So basically, Grub is the most widely used one, and it's the one I used even though it's not the default system boot. As for CachyOS, it supports both BIOS and UEFI, and it allows you to manage multiple operating systems. Obviously, the system boot, the second one, as we can see, is much more minimalist. It's integrated with System ID, and it's more recommended, so to speak, from what I've read, especially for UEFI type systems. And then we basically have RFIND not refined, which is a boot manager exclusively for the EFI system. It's useful for those who obviously have multiple operating systems installed and want a more visual interface for selection. By the way, I have to say before finishing this slide that even though I ended up choosing Grub, the interface is really very nice and graphical. Finally, let's look at Limine or Limine, which is a modern, lightweight bootloader that was recently adopted in CachyOS instead of Grub, and it works with both BIOS and UEFI systems. So why is that? Because of course it gives us the ability not only to choose between multiple bootloaders, but also multiple desktop environments, and CachyOS, just like Arch Linux, is a minimalist distribution where you need to add things rather than remove them. Obviously, this is part of the installation process. I selected Italian as the language, Rome as the time zone, as you can see here in the locations, and the default keyboard is set to Italian. There you go. Obviously, you can see that on the NVMe I installed Windows on a 1 GB partition. Basically, I didn't choose manual partitioning, but instead I installed it directly on a second drive, which you can see here is the 256. 156. To be able to install the operating system, which is also an NVMe 256 gigabytes. Once I selected it, I installed the OS on the entire disk, erasing all the data currently present on the available memory so that it would also install the bootloader directly. Well, look here, we have a plethora of truly enviable desktops. Plasma, GNOME, XFCE 4, Perlind, LST, Mate, OpenBox, and so on. Of course, I chose the Plasma Desktop in its most modern rolling release version. Next, we have the installation of the CachyOS packages. From the development side of the common packages, I chose the KD desktop and basically installed Firefox, so with some language options, as it says, add Firefox in language pack if possible, and a few, let's say, specifics regarding the CPU, but actually everything here is pretty much preset. As you can see, I then started looking at the KD desktop, which also gives you the option to remove anything you don't want to use. Pain point. So for my systems at home, I don't have any sensitive data. I'm not a CIA agency. And whether I do one thing or another or A or B, I don't really bother too much with passwords, unlike at work or in other places. Here, however, it still requires a password that meets the standards, one that's long enough and meets specific requirements. Not that it can't be changed later, but first you have to set a password to be able to change it, and then you also have to check the policies for changing the password. There might be some files in etc.config where you need to set the minimum or maximum password length and maybe some other configuration parameters. All right, here it has started. If everything has gone well, this is how it should look. Now the installation of CachyOS begins, the Arch-based distribution offering an easy installation, several customizations, and expert system administration. Then here it talks again about the improvements, but we've already discussed them earlier. It was compiled with the x86_64 v3 and v4 architectures, the Z architecture, and it also includes packages optimized with Bolt, which is the scheduler we mentioned before, as well as Python, GCC, LVM, and Clang, which are among the most performant. And then, of course, we also have all the CachyOS settings, a package which preconfigures RAM, NVIDIA tweaks, journaling ideas, and system configuration. Obviously, these should be used with caution and are intended for more advanced users. All the desktop environments are still available, and we've already talked about them, in this case KD, Cosmic, GNOME, and Cinnamon. Here it gives us an overview and also tells us about the different types of kernels, because we can use various types of kernels depending on the different types of schedulers to maximize performance, something I've never actually found in regular distributions. And here, as we can see, Linux OS, CachyOS, the default kernel BMQ scheduler. You can see here the different types of Linux schedulers: cache,